The neighborhood was quiet in the early morning, birds chirping and the sun casting a warm glow over the perfectly trimmed lawns. The protagonist, a homeowner who had moved in a few years ago, had always enjoyed the calm life there. Their house sat on a corner, surrounded by other houses that looked almost identical, each with its own garden, driveway, and carefully arranged decorations. The protagonist took pride in keeping the yard neat, planting flowers in the spring, making small improvements to the house when they had time. Life was peaceful, or so it seemed. Not far from their house lived a woman known by everyone in the neighborhood as HOA, Karen. She was the kind of neighbor who always seemed to be looking over everyone's fences, checking lawns, and taking notes on what she thought was wrong. Karen had been living in the neighborhood for many years and had built a reputation for being strict and controlling. She was always ready with a complaint, whether it was about the height of a bush, the color of a door, or even the kind of flowers someone planted. Most neighbors tried to avoid conflict with her, giving in to minor requests to keep her calm. But the protagonist had always kept a polite distance. At first, Karen seemed harmless. She would wave politely when passing by and occasionally offer tips about the neighborhood rules. But soon, the protagonist noticed a pattern. Karen's tips always came with an expectation, a hidden threat, or a suggestion that bordered on controlling. One morning, the protagonist found a letter slipped under the front door. It was from the HOA, complaining that their driveway had a small crack and suggesting it be repaired immediately. There was no urgency, no real problem, just a note pointing out something small that had gone unnoticed. At first, the protagonist ignored it, thinking it was trivial. However, this was only the beginning. Over the next few months, Karen became more persistent. She sent notes about lawn care, the angle of a garden fence, and even questioned the kind of mulch being used. The protagonist found it strange that Karen seemed to know every detail of the property, as if she was constantly watching. Other neighbors whispered about how controlling she could be, but no one had the courage to confront her directly. Some had tried, and each time, Karen found a way to twist the situation to make herself appear in the right. The protagonist began to feel the tension. Simple acts like planting a new bush or repainting the front door suddenly required careful consideration. What if Karen objected? What if she sent another complaint to the HOA? Even friendly gestures, like borrowing a ladder from a neighbor or hosting a small gathering in the backyard, were scrutinized in Karen's eyes. It became a quiet kind of stress, an invisible weight that hung over the protagonist's daily life. Every morning, they walked around the property, checking for anything Karen might consider wrong, and every evening, they worried about what new complaint might appear. Despite the stress, the protagonist tried to remain calm. They believed in living peacefully and not letting Karen's behavior ruin their enjoyment of the home. They continued to plant flowers, fix minor issues, and keep the property in excellent condition. But Karen's presence was always felt. She would stand by her window, watching the yard, or walk past with a sharp gaze that made the protagonist feel uncomfortable. There were moments when Karen would call over other neighbors, pointing out minor details in a loud voice, as if she were conducting an inspection. The protagonist noticed that some neighbors laughed nervously, while others quickly agreed with Karen to avoid confrontation. One day, Karen sent an official notice to the HOA, claiming that the protagonist had placed a decorative statue too close to the sidewalk. It was a small stone figure of a bird, barely noticeable to anyone who passed by. But Karen described it as a violation of aesthetic rules and demanded its removal. The protagonist was shocked. They had not realized that Karen was monitoring every single detail and taking notes to escalate issues. The thought that someone could be so focused on controlling others was unsettling. It made the protagonist question why Karen acted this way. But they quickly realized that some people thrived on control and attention. The protagonist decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address the complaint. The room was filled with familiar faces, all neighbors who had grown used to Karen's presence and influence. Karen arrived early, wearing a stern expression and carrying a folder filled with documents, presumably to support her claims. The protagonist felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. They knew they had done nothing wrong and wanted to make that clear without causing a scene. When the meeting began, Karen spoke first. Her voice was sharp and confident, pointing out minor details that most people would have overlooked. She emphasized rules and regulations, making it seem as if she were the protector of the neighborhood's standards. The protagonist listened patiently, waiting for the right moment to respond. When it was their turn, they spoke calmly and politely, explaining that the statue had been placed with care and did not pose any safety risk. They highlighted the beauty it added to the property and noted that it complied with all HOA regulations. Some neighbors nodded quietly, appreciating the calm and respectful approach. Despite the explanation, Karen refused to back down. She argued loudly, insisting that the statue disrupted the uniformity of the neighborhood. The tension in the room was palpable. Other homeowners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. The protagonist remained composed, refusing to let Karen's anger provoke them. They had learned that staying calm was the most effective way to handle such situations. By the end of the meeting, the HOA decided to allow the statue to remain, citing no actual violation. Karen left the room fuming, muttering under her breath, while the protagonist felt a small but meaningful victory. After that incident, the protagonist became more aware of Karen's behavior. It was clear that she would continue to monitor, complain, and try to control. The protagonist was determined not to let her actions dominate their life. They realized that the key was knowledge and preparation. Understanding HOA rules, documenting everything, and maintaining a respectful but firm stance became the new approach. The tension remained, but now the protagonist felt a sense of empowerment. They could no longer be easily intimidated. Each day became an exercise in quiet vigilance. The neighborhood continued as usual, with children playing on the sidewalks, neighbors walking dogs, and families going about their routines. But the protagonist noticed a subtle shift. Other homeowners began to observe Karen differently. They saw how she pushed boundaries, how she seemed to enjoy stirring conflict, and how she could intimidate those who were not prepared. Slowly, a quiet support network formed, with neighbors appreciating the protagonist's calm handling of the situation. They began to see that standing firm, without aggression, could change the dynamic. In the following weeks, protagonists focused on enjoying the home rather than worrying constantly. They spent mornings tending to the garden, afternoons reading on the porch, and evenings walking the perimeter of the property to relax. Karen still made appearances, sending notes or inspecting the yard. But the protagonists now faced these moments with confidence rather than fear. They realized that a home was meant to be a place of peace, not anxiety, and that maintaining boundaries was essential. Every minor victory, like a complaint dismissed or a project completed without interference, reinforced their sense of control. The protagonist also began keeping detailed records of all communications, letters, and complaints. They photographed the property regularly, noting improvements and documenting compliance with all HOA regulations. This preparation created a sense of security. No longer would Karen's words alone hold power. There was proof to support the protagonist's position. The small steps of vigilance and planning became a shield against unnecessary conflict, allowing the protagonist to reclaim a sense of normalcy. As the months passed, the neighborhood settled into a rhythm. Karen continued her attempts at control, but they were met with calm resistance and quiet confidence. The protagonist felt a growing sense of mastery over their own space. They had learned an important lesson: knowledge, preparation, and patience could turn a tense situation into one of empowerment. While Karen's anger and persistence were still present, they no longer dictated the protagonist's happiness. By the end of the first year, the protagonist's life had shifted subtly but significantly. Their property remained beautiful and well-maintained. Their daily routines were peaceful, and interactions with neighbors had improved. Karen's attempts to intimidate had become less frequent, and the protagonist felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that they were no longer a passive participant in their own home life. They had learned to navigate the complexities of neighborhood dynamics, balancing respect for rules with assertiveness and self-assurance. And while Karen remained a challenge, the protagonist was ready for whatever came next, confident in their ability to handle it with grace, patience, and determination. The days after the first confrontation with HOA Karen passed quietly at first. The protagonist had gained a small victory, but the feeling of tension never fully went away. Karen's eyes seemed to follow every movement, and her whispers to other neighbors made it clear she was not ready to back down. Despite this, the protagonist began to notice something that sparked curiosity and a sense of possibility. While checking some property records online for their own peace of mind, they stumbled upon a detail that caught them off guard. The property map showed boundaries and ownership details for every plot in the neighborhood. As they scrolled through the data, the protagonist realized something remarkable. Much of the land surrounding their home, including small strips and parcels that Karen often treated as hers, were actually owned by them. These were legal designations that had been established years ago, but no one, not even Karen, seemed to be aware of them. For the protagonist, the realization brought a mix of surprise, amusement, and a spark of empowerment. The land that Karen constantly monitored and tried to control wasn't hers at all, it was theirs. For a few days, the protagonist studied the documents carefully. They examined maps, property deeds, and records from the local county office. Each paper confirmed the same thing: the borders, the corners, and even small strips of land along pathways and shared spaces were legally theirs. The realization began to change their perspective. Up until now, they had been cautious, careful, almost submissive to avoid Karen's wrath. Now, they saw an opportunity to reclaim authority. Quietly, but decisively, they didn't rush to act immediately. Instead, the protagonist observed, they watched Karen walk her usual path along the perimeter of her perceived territory, inspecting fences, hedges, and decorative elements. Karen's sharp gaze would pause at certain areas. She would mutter complaints to herself or call neighbors over to discuss what she deemed violations. The protagonist now knew that Karen's sense of control was based on assumption, not fact. And that assumption was about to be challenged. With careful planning, the protagonists began documenting their ownership clearly. They made copies of every deed, highlighted boundaries, and even took photographs of the property lines. They started a notebook, noting details that could be useful if any conflict arose. Each day, they felt a growing sense of confidence. What once seemed like a stressful, almost oppressive situation now became a game of strategy. Knowledge was power, and the protagonist was armed with it. The first opportunity to assert this new awareness came in a small but meaningful way. Karen had recently criticized a cluster of bushes that bordered one of the small parcels. She claimed that the hedges were intruding and needed to be trimmed or removed. The protagonist, knowing that the land legally belonged to them, decided to make a subtle but pointed change. They rearranged the bushes slightly, planted new flowers, and made improvements that Karen had previously demanded. When Karen came by to inspect, the protagonist casually mentioned, with a calm smile, that the area in question was part of their property. Karen looked confused, and a small ripple of laughter came from neighbors who had gathered nearby. The moment, though quiet, marked the beginning of a shift. Instead of confrontations escalating into shouting matches, the protagonist discovered the power of calm assertion backed by facts. Karen tried to argue, but the protagonist simply showed the deed, pointing out the legal boundaries. It was not aggressive. It was a simple statement of fact. Karen, accustomed to pushing people into compliance through intimidation, found herself at a loss. She had always assumed authority in the neighborhood, but this evidence removed her power. Neighbors began to notice the change. They had long watched the tension between Karen and the protagonist, unsure of who would prevail. Some had quietly wished someone would stand up to Karen, and now they were seeing it happen in a measured, confident way. The protagonist became a model of composed authority. They were firm but not confrontational, clear but not mean-spirited. This subtle approach earned respect quietly, without causing a spectacle. Encouraged, the protagonist began to make additional improvements to the property. Small projects that had been delayed due to fear of Karen's reaction were now possible. They installed garden features, repaired minor damages, and even expanded certain areas that legally belonged to them. Every action was done with care and attention, ensuring there was no actual violation of HOA rules. The point was not to antagonize Karen, but to assert rightful ownership and reclaim a sense of control over their own home. Karen's reaction was a mixture of anger and disbelief. She would come by unannounced, expecting resistance or groveling, but found only calm explanations and proof-backed responses. Her sharp words and complaints became less effective. The protagonist noticed that Karen's usual confident demeanor started to falter when faced with facts and evidence. She began muttering under her breath, occasionally making small complaints. But the force she once wielded over the neighborhood was diminishing. This newfound clarity also allowed the protagonist to reflect on why Karen behaved as she did. They realized that her need for control stemmed from a combination of insecurity and long-standing habits. She had been the unofficial enforcer in the neighborhood for years, but her power was largely assumed rather than legally established. Recognizing this helped the protagonist respond without anger or frustration. They treated Karen not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a challenge to navigate with intelligence and calm. This approach made interactions less stressful and more strategic. As weeks went by, the protagonist continued to monitor the property and keep records. Every day, they felt more secure and in control. Simple actions like planting flowers or repairing fences were no longer anxiety-inducing. Even hosting small gatherings became possible without fear of interference. Karen's attempts to dominate were still present, but the protagonist now approached them with the quiet assurance that comes from knowing the law and having evidence to support their actions. The neighborhood itself began to shift subtly. Other neighbors observed the protagonist handling situations calmly and effectively. Some who had once been intimidated by Karen started to take a more relaxed approach to her complaints. Realizing that her influence could be challenged, the protagonist's example created a ripple effect, showing that careful preparation and patience could change the dynamics of power in the neighborhood without creating unnecessary conflict. There were moments of tension, of course. Karen would occasionally try to catch the protagonist off guard, arriving unexpectedly or raising minor issues in meetings. But each time, the protagonist remained composed. They would calmly present documentation, explain boundaries, and assert ownership in a respectful manner. Over time, Karen's outbursts became less frequent, and her attempts to dominate the conversation lost their impact. The quiet authority of the protagonist was more powerful than anger or intimidation. During this period, the protagonist also built stronger relationships with other neighbors. By showing fairness, respect, and calmness, they became a trusted figure in the community. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to speak up now sought advice, shared concerns, and quietly supported the protagonist in navigating HOA dynamics. This network of support further reinforced the protagonist's sense of empowerment, making the neighborhood a more cooperative and less stressful place. The lessons learned during this time were profound. The protagonist realized that control and power could be quiet and measured, based on facts and preparation rather than aggression. They had transformed from a cautious, anxious homeowner into someone who could navigate complex social and legal dynamics with confidence. This knowledge not only made life more peaceful, but also gave them a sense of mastery over their environment. By the end of this period, the protagonist had taken ownership literally and figuratively of the land around them. Karen's constant scrutiny no longer dictated their actions, and the protagonist was free to enjoy their home, make improvements, and live without fear of arbitrary complaints. The tension with Karen remained, but it had shifted from a source of stress to a manageable challenge, one that could be addressed calmly and strategically. The protagonist now looked at the neighborhood differently. They saw not just houses and lawns, but boundaries, rights, and opportunities. Every corner of their property represented security and authority. They walked the yard with pride, knowing that knowledge and preparation had given them power and confidence. Karen, once a looming presence of control, had lost her ability to intimidate. The protagonist had discovered that patience, observation, and calm action could turn a difficult situation into a position of strength. This realization marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where the protagonist was in charge of their own home and the life they wanted to live. The days following the protagonist's discovery of the property ownership were filled with a mix of anticipation and careful planning. They had already begun making subtle improvements, quietly reclaiming the land around their home. But a new challenge was looming. HOA Karen, ever vigilant, would not remain unaware forever. She had grown accustomed to her assumed authority and would eventually confront the protagonist directly. The thought of that moment brought both nervousness and determination. But the protagonist was ready to face it with patience and strategy. It began one sunny morning when Karen appeared at the edge of the protagonist's property. She was inspecting a newly planted row of flowers along a small strip of land that had previously been part of her complaints. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning each bloom, her posture tense with authority. The protagonist watched from a distance, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety, but also a growing sense of calm. This time, they were prepared. They had the deeds, maps, and documentation neatly organized and ready for any confrontation. Karen's voice broke the quiet morning air. She demanded to know why the flowers were planted so close to the sidewalk, claiming it violated neighborhood aesthetic rules. She stepped closer, pointing at the carefully arranged blooms, her expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. The protagonist stepped forward, calm and composed, and explained that the land in question was legally theirs. They presented the deed, highlighting the boundaries and the legal ownership of the strip. Karen's confident demeanor wavered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of surprise. The confrontation drew the attention of a few neighbors who were walking past or tending to their own gardens. They paused to watch, sensing the tension in the air. Karen, accustomed to controlling situations through intimidation, tried to regain her composure. She raised her voice, insisting that the flowers disrupted the uniformity of the neighborhood and that the protagonist had no right to plant them. The protagonist remained calm, repeating the facts and showing the official documents. There was no aggression, only quiet authority backed by undeniable evidence. Karen's anger grew, but it was now clear that the protagonist was not intimidated. She muttered under her breath, attempting to argue further, but the calm, factual responses left her with no leverage. Neighbors, who had previously been hesitant to challenge her, began to notice the shift. The protagonist's demeanor and preparation highlighted a subtle but powerful truth. Authority and respect came from knowledge, not intimidation. Karen's usual tactics were ineffective against someone who was organized and composed. Over the next few days, the protagonist continued to make small but meaningful improvements to the property. They repaired pathways, added decorative features, and carefully landscaped areas that had been a point of contention. Each action was deliberate, ensuring compliance with HOA rules while subtly asserting ownership. Karen would occasionally appear, inspecting these changes, but the protagonist responded with calm explanations and documented proof. The pattern became clear. Karen's attempts to control were gradually losing power. While the protagonist's quiet authority was growing, the protagonist also began engaging with neighbors in small ways. Sharing tips on landscaping and property maintenance, always in a friendly and respectful tone, this approach fostered goodwill and reinforced their position within the community. Neighbors began to see that standing firm with facts, while maintaining a courteous demeanor, was far more effective than fear or confrontation. The protagonist's example quietly inspired others, showing that it was possible to navigate difficult relationships with tact and preparation. One afternoon, Karen attempted to escalate the situation further. She called an impromptu neighborhood meeting, insisting that the protagonist's recent improvements were violations that needed to be addressed immediately. The protagonist, prepared as always, attended the meeting with copies of all relevant documents and photographs, showing property boundaries and compliance with HOA rules. Karen arrived with a folder of her own, ready to argue and intimidate. But the dynamic had already shifted. At the meeting, Karen spoke first, presenting her points with her usual confidence. She pointed to minor details, attempting to create the impression that the protagonist had overstepped. The room was tense, neighbors watching quietly, unsure of how the confrontation would unfold. When it was the protagonist's turn, they spoke calmly, presenting facts, maps, and photographs in a clear and concise manner. They explained the legal ownership of the land, the purpose of the improvements, and how every action complied with HOA regulations. The contrast was striking. Karen's anger versus the protagonist's composed authority. The meeting revealed an important truth. Preparation and calmness could neutralize even the most aggressive opposition. Karen tried to interject, raise objections, and appeal to the neighbors. But the protagonist's evidence was clear and irrefutable. The tension in the room shifted, with some neighbors quietly nodding in agreement. Karen's usual influence was weakened, and her attempts to dominate the discussion were no longer effective. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the protagonist had established a new sense of authority within the neighborhood. Following the meeting, Karen's behavior began to change subtly. She still monitored the property and occasionally raised minor complaints, but her confidence was diminished. The protagonist noticed that she no longer approached interactions with the same aggressive posture, and her attempts to intimidate were met with calm, factual responses. The protagonist's patience and preparation had transformed the dynamic, turning confrontation into manageable challenges rather than sources of stress. The protagonist also continued to strengthen relationships with other neighbors. By showing fairness, respect, and knowledge, they became a trusted figure in the community. Neighbors who had once felt trapped by Karen's behavior began to feel more confident and secure. The protagonist's example demonstrated that challenges could be met with intelligence and composure rather than fear or aggression. This quiet leadership fostered a sense of community, reinforcing the protagonist's position and diminishing Karen's influence. In addition to dealing with Karen, the protagonist focused on enjoying and improving their property. They spent time tending to gardens, repairing structures, and making thoughtful additions that enhanced both aesthetics and functionality. Every project was approached with care, ensuring compliance with rules while asserting ownership. These improvements brought satisfaction and pride, reinforcing the protagonist's sense of control over their environment. Karen's occasional visits became less intimidating. The protagonist had learned to anticipate her actions, respond calmly, and maintain composure under pressure. Each interaction, once a source of anxiety, was now an opportunity to demonstrate knowledge, preparation, and quiet authority. The protagonist's confidence grew with every successful encounter, transforming what had once been a stressful situation into a position of strength. Over time, the neighborhood dynamics continued to shift. Neighbors observed the protagonist handling situations effectively and respectfully, which inspired a subtle change in the community. Karen's once dominant presence was now tempered by the protagonist's calm authority. The quiet shift demonstrated that knowledge, preparation, and patience could alter relationships and power dynamics without creating unnecessary conflict. The protagonist's approach became a model for navigating difficult social situations within the community. The confrontation with Karen also reinforced an important personal lesson for the protagonist. They realized that fear and avoidance were no longer necessary tools for survival. Instead, preparation, evidence, and calm communication could create a foundation of strength. This understanding extended beyond the immediate neighborhood, influencing the protagonist's confidence and approach in other areas of life. The experience with Karen became a reminder that challenges could be met effectively through intelligence, patience, and measured action. As the days turned into weeks, the protagonist continued to assert ownership and improve their property. Karen remained present but less threatening, and the protagonist no longer felt the weight of constant anxiety. They had successfully navigated the first direct confrontation, establishing authority and demonstrating that intimidation could be neutralized through calmness and preparation. The neighborhood, once a source of tension, began to feel like a space of quiet empowerment and control. By the end of this period, the protagonist had not only reclaimed control over their property, but it also reshaped the social dynamic of the neighborhood. Karen's influence had waned, and the protagonist's reputation as a composed and knowledgeable homeowner had grown. This transformation marked a turning point, showing that challenges could be faced with strategy, patience, and dignity. The protagonist had learned to navigate confrontation, assert authority, and maintain calm in the face of aggression, setting the stage for future developments and a more confident, empowered life in their home and community. The tension in the neighborhood had been building for months, and it was clear that a larger confrontation was inevitable. Karen, known for her relentless scrutiny and need for control, had been increasingly frustrated by the protagonist's calm and well-prepared responses. She had tried minor intimidation tactics, casual complaints, and subtle manipulation, but none of these worked. The protagonist's knowledge of property boundaries, his careful documentation, and composed demeanor had gradually undermined her influence. Yet Karen was not one to give up easily. She decided to escalate the situation by calling a full neighborhood meeting, hoping to sway others and reassert her control. The protagonist, aware that Karen's move was coming, prepared meticulously. They gathered every document, photograph, and piece of evidence related to their property. Maps showing boundaries, deeds proving ownership, and even records of previous complaints were organized neatly in a folder. The goal was not to intimidate or humiliate Karen, but to clearly and calmly demonstrate the truth. The protagonist also practiced explanations, anticipating questions and objections, so that each point could be presented logically and respectfully. On the day of the meeting, the community room was filled with neighbors. Some arrived early, curious to see how the confrontation would unfold, while others came out of a sense of obligation or concern. Karen arrived shortly after, carrying her own folder of documents and notes. Her face was set in a determined frown, projecting confidence and control. She immediately began speaking to anyone who would listen, outlining her grievances and emphasizing minor perceived violations. Her voice carried through the room, sharp and assertive, a clear signal that she expected to dominate the discussion. The protagonist waited patiently, observing the room and the audience. They noticed the nervous glances of some neighbors, the restrained curiosity of others, and the subtle tension that filled the space. When it was their turn to speak, they rose calmly, holding the folder of evidence. There was no aggression in their voice, only clarity and composure. They began by acknowledging Karen's concerns respectfully, and gradually introduced facts, evidence, and legal documents proving ownership and compliance with HOA rules. Each statement was concise, supported by visual proof, and delivered in a tone that conveyed authority without anger. Karen's initial reaction was to interrupt, insisting that the protagonist was overstepping and that her own observations should hold weight. She spoke louder, gesturing toward neighbors to gain support. The protagonist listened, maintaining calm eye contact, then responded by presenting a map showing the exact boundaries, highlighting areas that Karen assumed were under her control. They explained the history of the property ownership, the legal rights established years before, and the steps they had taken to maintain and improve the land. Each point was factual and unemotional, designed to clarify rather than attack. As the discussion continued, it became clear that the balance of power had shifted. Neighbors began to pay closer attention to the facts. Comparing Karen's claims with the evidence the protagonist presented, some whispered quietly to each other, others nodded in understanding. Karen's confidence faltered as she realized that her assumptions were being challenged with undeniable proof. The room's energy changed, moving from tension and anticipation to a quiet acknowledgement of the truth. Karen's usual dominance was slipping away. She struggled to maintain control. The protagonist continued to present evidence methodically. They showed photographs of the property over time, documenting improvements in compliance with HOA rules. They shared records of past communications, highlighting that previous complaints had been addressed appropriately. They explained the rationale behind each improvement, demonstrating care, attention, and responsibility. By presenting facts calmly and consistently, the protagonist created an environment in which reason, not intimidation, guided the discussion. Karen, realizing that her usual tactics were ineffective, attempted a final push. She raised her voice, emphasizing minor details and questioning motives. Her gestures became more animated, and she tried to rally support from neighbors. The protagonist, however, remained composed. They responded calmly, reinforcing the facts and legal evidence, and avoided engaging in emotional exchanges. Each rebuttal was polite but firm, emphasizing clarity and reason over anger or conflict. Throughout the meeting, the protagonist noticed subtle shifts in the audience. Neighbors who had once deferred to Karen began to speak quietly among themselves, acknowledging the accuracy of the evidence and the fairness of the protagonist's approach. Some asked clarifying questions, which allowed the protagonist to further demonstrate their knowledge and preparedness. The dynamic was transforming. Karen's attempts to dominate were being met with rational clarity, and her influence was diminishing visibly as the discussion reached its peak. The HOA board, previously silent, began to weigh in. They acknowledged the documentation and maps presented by the protagonist, recognizing that the evidence clearly established ownership and compliance. Karen's arguments, while emotionally charged, lacked legal support. The board gently but firmly explained that decisions must be based on documented facts rather than assumptions or personal interpretations. Karen's face reflected frustration and disbelief as she realized that her attempts to regain control were officially invalidated. The room, now filled with quiet observation and realization, experienced a shift in energy. Neighbors exchanged glances, some smiling subtly, recognizing that the long-standing tension was finally being resolved through calm and factual discussion. Karen, realizing that her influence had waned significantly, continued to argue briefly, but with diminishing intensity. Each attempt to challenge the protagonist was met with polite, fact-based responses, leaving her increasingly isolated in her position. The protagonist, sensing the moment, concluded their presentation with a calm statement summarizing ownership, compliance, and commitment to maintaining the neighborhood responsibly. There was no triumphalism, no mockery, only clarity and assurance. The atmosphere in the room, once charged with tension, shifted toward understanding. Karen, despite her efforts, was left without leverage, unable to sway the audience or challenge the facts presented. Following the meeting, the protagonist noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood dynamic. Neighbors who had observed the confrontation expressed quiet support, acknowledging the protagonist's calm and prepared approach. Karen's attempts at intimidation became less frequent and noticeably less effective. The protagonist's authority, grounded in facts and respectful communication, had established a new baseline for interactions. Karen could no longer dominate the narrative or control perceptions through aggression alone. In the days that followed, the protagonists continued to improve and maintain their property with confidence. They planted gardens, repaired structures, and made thoughtful enhancements, all within HOA regulations. Karen's occasional inspections became less threatening, met with calm explanations and documentation. The protagonist's sense of control and empowerment grew, reinforcing the lessons learned through preparation, observation, and strategic communication. The neighborhood itself began to reflect the shift. Other residents, inspired by the protagonist's composed handling of the situation, began to approach minor conflicts with reason and preparation rather than fear or avoidance. A subtle but meaningful cultural change emerged, emphasizing evidence, communication, and respect over intimidation and assumptions. The protagonist's example demonstrated that challenges could be addressed effectively without escalating tension or creating unnecessary conflict. Karen, though still present, faced the reality of diminished influence. Her attempts to manipulate or intimidate neighbors no longer produced the desired effect. The protagonist had not only defended their rights, but it also reshaped the social dynamics of the community. The shift was quiet yet profound, showing that authority could be grounded in knowledge, preparation, and composure rather than force or aggression. The experience also reinforced important personal lessons for the protagonist. They learned the value of patience, strategic thinking, and calm communication in navigating complex social situations. They understood that standing firm with facts and evidence could resolve conflicts without resorting to confrontation or anger. The sense of empowerment gained through this process extended beyond the neighborhood, influencing confidence and decision-making in other areas of life. By the end of this period, the protagonist had successfully navigated the public showdown. Karen's influence had waned. Neighbors had observed and appreciated the protagonist's composed authority, and the community had begun to shift toward a more balanced, reason-based approach to disputes. The protagonist had established a foundation of respect, clarity, and empowerment that would guide future interactions and ensure a sense of security and ownership over their home and property. The aftermath of the meeting marked a turning point. Karen's presence, once a source of constant stress and tension, became manageable. The protagonist had demonstrated that preparation, documentation, and calm, respectful communication could neutralize aggression and re-establish authority. The neighborhood, once tense and uncertain, began to experience a more cooperative and understanding environment, with the protagonist serving as a quiet but effective example of how to navigate difficult interpersonal dynamics. The protagonists continued to refine their approach, maintaining detailed records of property improvements and communications, and engaging neighbors respectfully and thoughtfully. Karen's influence remained diminished. Her attempts to assert control met with clarity and calm. The protagonist's sense of security and empowerment grew daily, reinforcing the lessons learned from this intense and challenging confrontation. The neighborhood, while not free from minor disagreements, now had a mode